Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 106 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Joseph Warren. We know what these Boston revolutionaries look like thanks to the work of John Singleton Copley. Copley stands as one of the founding fathers of the American art world, and he not only knew and painted some of Boston's most famous revolutionaries, he also witnessed the American Revolution as it unfolded, in events such as the Stamp Act riots of 1765, the Boston Massacre in 1770, and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Today, we explore the life and times of John Singleton Copley with Jane Kamensky, a professor of history at Harvard University and the author of A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley. During our conversation, Jane reveals John Singleton Copley's early life and how he became a painter, information about Copley's art and how he earned a living as a painter, and Copley's involvement with and views on the American Revolution. But first, I need to provide you with a bit of information for our investigation. During our conversation, Jane discusses femme soles, and I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't ask her because I was engrossed in our conversation, and because years ago I read a great book on the subject called Not All Wives, Women of Colonial Philadelphia. It's by a historian named Karen Wolfe. You should know that femme soles were unmarried women. They were women who never married, widows, and divorcees. And because they were unmarried, early American society viewed femme soles as heads of households, which means they can make contracts and own and devise property. Unmarried women lived interesting lives in early America, and we're going to discuss one of these women today. If you're interested in discovering more about the lives of unmarried women, you should check out Karen Wolfe's book, Not All Wives. I'll include a link to it in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. Are you ready to explore the life and times of John Singleton Copley? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a professor of history at Harvard University and the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's a historian of early America and the Atlantic world, with a particular interest in the histories of family, culture, and everyday life. Today, she joins us to discuss details from her new book, A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jane Kamensky.
Hi, Liz. It's good to be with you. Thanks.
John Singleton Copley is a figure who we associate with the American Revolution, but he isn't what we would call a founding father. Jane, what brought you to study Copley, and why do you find him so interesting?
It's been a long road, Liz, as is the case with many books. I started out actually studying Gilbert Stuart. I had written a book called The Exchange Artist about speculation in early America, and Stuart painted the protagonist of that book in a kind of climactic scene in the narrative. And I started working on portraiture and speculation in the early American Republic, and particularly on the way that Stuart had helped to create the nation of faces that we all associate with the Revolutionary era. And I got a grant to study American and British art history, Anglophone 18th century art history in London in 2007, 2008. I was over working at the Courtauld Institute and started to place Stuart in the whole cohort of provincial Britons who had spent part of their training years in London on the eve of and during the American Revolution. So beginning with the first to arrive in 1763 with Benjamin West and extending through Copley and then Stuart and Matthew Pratt and Mather Brown and John Trumbull and a whole sort of busy cast of others who were there working in London in the generation that spanned the Revolution. And as I worked on that project, I realized that Copley was coming to speak for them all because he is the rare visual intellectual who left a large written corpus. I was very frustrated when I was working at first on Stuart that he had left very little behind. There are literally like 2 pages of an account book and a couple of receipts. And I remember saying to an art historian how frustrating I found this, that Stuart hadn't written more. And she said, "Is anyone ever frustrated that you don't paint more?" So I think visual intellectuals like Copley was, and like West was, and maybe Stewart was. I'm not sure if we would call him an intellectual, but they often were not of a class or of a cast of mind to leave extensive written records. And Copley emerged as the voice of this group because I think he had a kind of questing spirit that he worked out in family letters. About 1,000 family letters survive, and several hundred of those are in his hand or directly in conversation with him. So he kind of took over the story almost in the way that novelists say that their characters take over. His voice was so urgent and so searing in some ways, and not only his art, but his life story and his character, for lack of a better word, his posture of vexed ambivalence in a period that we know is a period of easy certitude, opened up a much bigger story. What I had thought was an early Republic story became a Revolutionary era story, and what I had thought was a firmly American United States story became a British Atlantic story. So I felt very lucky to make his acquaintance so powerfully early in a kind of twisting road to this project.
So what did all of these letters and pieces of family correspondence that you found reveal about Copley's life? I mean, how did Copley get his start, and how did he become a painter?
As you know, as a historian who works with similar kinds of documents, one of the challenges of writing about somebody's early life is that his earliest letters don't kick in until his 20s, and that's a very typical thing. So the first stretch of the recovery of his life is really straight up social history, working in deeds and church registers and newspapers. A lot of it is still a black box to me. We know he was born in 1738 because by the time he was an older man, he was of the sentimental cast who referenced his own birthday. We don't know where he was born. We know it was in New England. It was almost certainly in Boston, but there is no record of his birth or his baptism. His parents were immigrants from Ireland in a period where Anglo-Irish immigration was beginning to pick up, and I've placed them in Boston in a relatively brief period of concentrated Irish immigration between circa 1735 and 1737-38. Largely a group of land speculations where promoters of large-scale projects took to colonize lands to the eastward, as people said in 18th century Massachusetts when they referenced contemporary Maine, went over to England and to Anglo-Ireland and found those sort of striving lower middling gentry who were likely to light out for the colonies with a land grant promise. And it is extremely probable that his father was one of those who signed on to such a project in Maine lands and came over with other similarly inclined people. Both of Copley's parents were moderately well born and yet not well enough born to make a go of it with their family resources. I think this is a very common story in many British American places, especially in the mid-Atlantic and in the southern continental colonies. It's a less common story in New England, and I think one of the interesting things about the Copley family is they force us to consider the New England story in that light. So his mother is, quite to the manor born in County Clare in Ireland. His father is born in Limerick, and yet they both wash up in the greater Massachusetts that includes what we would now call the Maine frontier. I know that Copley's father is here and alive in 1738. I know that he's still alive in 1741. He dies quite early in the story, likely considerably before Copley's mother remarried in 1748. One other thing about Copley's early life that I don't have through his eyes, but that as a social historian I came to think of as highly singular, he's an only child. And an only child in early modern times, especially in the, demographic oven of early New England, a place where families are large and life expectancies are nearly as long as they are until the 20th century. An only child is as rare as hen's teeth. I think man-woman couples who had no children, who were barren, as they would have said, were probably commoner than couples who had one child. So he has a quite unusual family structure, and this gives him both opportunities and burdens early in his life in ways that I came to think were significant, both economically and professionally and also psychologically.
That is really interesting because when you think of colonial New England, you think of big families needed to work a farm and maybe fewer children to work in a city, but still big families and not only children. So what kind of opportunities and burdens did Copley have as an only child?
I think we have to back it up by a generation and ask, who is the woman, Mary Singleton Copley, and then Pelham? She had one more marriage. We know she produced 2 offspring. There was a child that died very early in Ireland, very early in the marriage, but who produced 3 offspring over the course of a long, fertile life, who didn't remarry after her first husband died for as many as 10 years, and who didn't remarry after her second husband died ever. So her second husband dies in 1751 when she is approximately 40 or 41. Colonial American birth patterns, she's got quite a number of fertile years left. She's not a prosperous femme sole trader, and she doesn't remarry. And the first husband died when she was maybe 30, maybe as early as 30. And she didn't remarry for 10 years. So she is quite a singular character. We know from Copley's letters that she has some kind of chronic infirmity. There's a lot of mother is as well as can be expected, or mother is a little better than she was the last time. I can see in her hands, many of her letters survived. She's literate. She's arguably more literate than her son. Her spelling is better, so she's probably had more education than Copley did. It doesn't look like a physical infirmity that affected her penmanship. So she's fragile in some way. And I think that is a burden on the young man who spends a chunk of time as an only son, solitary with her, very early in life, and then a more knowable interval of time from the age of 13, when her second husband, Copley's stepfather, dies, really as the natal family's sole support. There may be support from collateral kin that I can't quite see. So the opportunity, he doesn't have a lot of competition for not his father's contributions, because I think, again, his father dies when Copley is maybe as young as 3, but for his stepfather's trade and tools. And his stepfather, Peter Pelham, English-born of Irish extraction, his stepfather's an engraver. So he has a kind of direct path to that trade and to any capital that his stepfather left behind, and that capital would have been in the form of trade goods, engravers, trade goods. The burdens are arguably more considerable, right? He has to figure out how he's going to make his way in the world and look after his mother, and also make a place for the 10 years younger half-brother, who I think is very much a brother to him, who's a product of his mother's second marriage.
Was it the tools left behind by Copley's stepfather that encouraged him to become a painter? And how did he train as a painter? Because it's my understanding that in Europe, artists in training go to art school and work with a master. Did someone like Copley, who was just trying to get into the trade, have the same opportunities in the colonies?
The opportunities in the colonies are certainly less formalized than they are in Europe. Art historians would say, not wrongly, that the mythology of Copley and his near exact contemporary, who's living a similar story in Pennsylvania, Benjamin West, there's a mythology of them as self-taught. West writes about it extensively himself and says in a sort of late autobiography that he had plucked hairs from the tail of his cat to make a brush and learned to make pigments from the face paints of Delaware and Shawnee warriors who he met in the woods of Pennsylvania. And a kind of similar frontier mythology about Copley bootstrapping his way to competence in the arts takes hold in his descendants' telling. So that's exaggerated. I think art historians are right about that. We know that, there are print shops, there are color shops, there is a visual culture in the colonies to look at and imitate. That said, the limitations of fancying oneself an artist in a place like provincial British America are utterly profound, more profound in Copley's Boston than in West's contemporary Philadelphia, which is a little more of a cultural hub than Boston was. So there are no classes. There's no local drawing master. There's no place where you can, in a sort of above board way, draw a nude figure. There's a little slip of an anecdote about Gilbert Stuart that survives where he and a neighbor who was interested in anatomy paid a blacksmith to strip for them in Rhode Island. I think that's probably the kind of thing that happened all the time as people tried to figure out how to represent human physiognomy. There are a group of artists who come through Boston, itinerants, and the great good fortune of Copley that his stepfather was an engraver who must have taught him some things between the moment that he joined this blended family. Copley was 10 in 1748, and the moment he died only 3 years later in 1751. There could have been the kind of informal apprenticeship that many people in many other trades would have had. If your father was a leather worker, you might have learned some early things about cutting the pieces of a shoe in that period. And Copley had a stepfather who was an engraver. The other really fortuitous thing for Copley is that a Scottish painter named John Smibert came to the colonies in the late 1720s with Bishop Berkeley's ill-starred venture to start a college in Bermuda. Produces the famous painting called the Bermuda Group, but the college never takes off. And Smibert had formal training in London. He had trained with the English artist Geoffrey Kneller. Smibert had taken the Grand Tour and had both collected engravings and prints in Italy and had done the thing that artists trained by doing on the Grand Tour. He had sat and copied in places like the Gallery of the Uffizi. And Smibert brought all that with him in his voyage to the colonies, I think it's 1728, and then settled in Boston and kept all that material and opened the closest thing to a cabinet of curiosities that you would have seen within about 3,000 miles. And that was on Queen Street in Boston. And even after Smibert died, around the time that Copley's stepfather died, you could still go to Smibert's shop and see his prints, the paintings that he had copied after Titian and Van Dyck. So if this sounds a bit like a game of telephone, Smibert studied with Kneller and saw Titian and Rubens on his tour through Europe and copied them, and Copley could beg attendance at the shop of the deceased Smibert and see Smibert's copies of those things and then try to produce his copies after those copies. That's how he learned. Boston has, as you know, a lively print culture. There are newspapers and bookshops, and these proliferate. There are books about artists and artists' lives. There aren't really recipe books for colors. That's more trade knowledge that's produced. The way that I've described it in the book is Copley really grows up in a black and white world, a world of engravings, and as the stepson of an engraver, learns quite a lot about line. Figuring out the world of color from the colonies is nearly impossible on both the recipe and the visual training level. It's interesting, one of the things that's said about Copley's work when it first begins to be seen by people in the capital of his nation, which is London, is that it's too liney. That word liney crops up in a number of early responses to Copley's paintings. And it totally makes sense. He's learned to paint as an engraver who looks at lines. He's almost painting by numbers from his own drawing, sort of filling in a world of color.
It sounds like Copley had a lot of talent, but he wasn't able to fully develop because he's living in colonial Boston, which was a place with a vibrant print culture, but wasn't a place that was known for being a fan of the arts. What kind of market was there for a wannabe artist like Copley to paint pictures and sell his work in Boston?
I want to just go back for a second to that word talent because it's really interesting. I think we have to recognize that we look back at the arts from a post-romantic period that calcified certain notions about talent and genius, right? So obviously he has a tremendous amount of inborn talent because I might need a way to support my family at the age of 13 and I would never pick up a brush. And he has a certain aspiration to a capital A art. At the same time, he lives in a world where art is a trade and artists are people who work with their hands. And I think the first thing he wants out of his talent is a competence. So, what are the possibilities for achieving that competence in America's British colonies? Boston, as you say, is, somewhat art averse, right? It's a culturally rich place. People care about print and education. There's the great University of the Colonies is on the edges of his Boston over here in Cambridge at Harvard. And yet it's not an enormously visually rich place. The Puritans are, we like to say, iconophobic. The Boston of the 1730s, 40s, 50s, when he's young, is still the descendant of John Winthrop's Boston. It's not a visually lush place and culture. People do want their likenesses. What there is a market for is portraits, so that people who want any art hanging in their house are likely to want to form some kind of visual representation of their family that creates a record of a lineage on their walls. And he is talented at fulfilling that desire, which is an elite desire in the 16th and 17th centuries, is becoming a more middling desire in the 18th century. It's estimated that maybe 1 in 100 people had some representation of themselves made in the later colonial period. So at a moment when the desire for portraiture is descending to some degree from princes and kings and government officials to merchants and lawyers and even prosperous femme sole traders, Copley is poised to answer that demand. And through talent, as you brought into this discussion very fruitfully, Liz, through talent, he's poised to do it better than anyone else who's traveling in the colonies. By the middle of the 7 Years' War, Smibert died, and Copley outclassed all of the local and itinerant talents as a man is to a boy. Like, he was just far and away the best painter who you could get to represent your likeness anywhere north of Philadelphia.
You mentioned that Copley's first desire with his painting was to earn a competence, an ability to provide for himself and his family. But in A Revolution in Color, you make it clear that Copley also desired to interact with the larger British art world. Would you tell us how Copley attempted to communicate and engage with this art world?
Sure, and let me back up to the 7 Years' War just a little bit. So just to sort of sketch a timeline for our listeners, Pelham dies in 1751, Copley's 13. His earliest paintings survive from 1753 and 1754 and are quite crude juvenilia that is about the equal of anyone else painting at the time in terms of technical ability, and is rapidly ascendant. And by 1755 and 1756, when the French and Indian War that we know as the 7 Years' War, they knew as the Fourth Indian War, when it begins bringing imperial officials and soldiers in significant number to New England, Copley is there ready to paint those folks. And that's a trade. That's a good trade, painting soldiers' pictures. I spent a long time talking about these early military portraits that really no one has ever concentrated on very much because they're incredibly formulaic. They're genre pictures of men in red coats. And he really cut his teeth as a tradesman, painting people wrapped in the fabric of empire. Red is very important in the history of his career. So that's the middle and late 1750s. When he first begins to dream of a London eye, I can't say, because we only know when he begins to act on that dream, which is in 1765. So in the year 1765, his road to a revolution in color begins at almost the self-same moment as the colonies' road, as what we look back on and think of as the colonies' road to revolution. In the spring of 1765, as Bostonians are beginning to rumble and grumble about the Stamp Act, Copley is working on a picture, what he would have called a picture with a capital P, in other words, an exhibition picture, no mere portrait, that becomes the small-sized canvas that we know as The Boy with a Squirrel, a picture of his half-brother, Harry Pelham. He ships that to London in September of 1765, just inside of 2 weeks after Thomas Hutchinson's house has been torn apart in the Boston Stamp Act mobs, ships it through a network of sea captains with whom he must have had a lot of contact. You can sort of hear in the background of the correspondence that this transaction, shipping this thing across to London, creates, that he must have had correspondence for at least an interval of time, say a couple of years, with people where he's saying, I want my work to be seen over there. How can I get there? By 1765, he has certainly read of Benjamin West's arrival in London and his rapid rise to celebrity. And Copley's also reading in Boston's bookstores about the rise of an English exhibition culture, also itself a 7 Years' War creation. So the culture of public exhibitions begins in 1760 in Britain. By 1765, Copley's sending this small picture over to be hung on the wall at the annual exhibition of the Society of Artists of Great Britain. And then, sort of waiting on the wharf for news to come back about what people think. I believe that when he sends that picture, he already sees a kind of fork in his biographical road where, depending on that reception, one would either stay and keep painting to achieve the competence that he's achieved, or make a more ambitious journey to the center of the nation he knows, so make a journey east to London. And the news comes back almost a full year later. It's late in 1766 when he hears about the reception of the painting, and that's when he begins to reckon this decision on paper in earnest in ways that we can directly hear it. But he must be thinking about it, 1763, 4, 5, sort of screwing up his courage. I think the man never acted precipitously in his life. At least I can't think of an occasion where the record has disclosed that. Maybe one thing about the character that would form around somebody who had such economic and psychological burdens on him so young. He was a very thoughtful, planful, diligent is a word he uses about himself, boy and then man. So I think to have sent that picture in September of 1765, he was growing up his courage for a long time before.
As you noted, Copley lived and worked in Boston during tumultuous times. He witnessed King George's War during the 1740s as a child and the French and Indian War during the 1750s as a young man. Then, during the 1760s and early 1770s, Copley witnessed Boston's violent protests against Parliament. Nick would like to know what effect the Stamp Act riots of 1765 had on Copley's art and his ability to earn an income as an artist.
The Stamp Act riots aren't as big a fork in his biography as we might think. It's a time of tremendous upheaval. Like many people in Boston, he begins that period of upheaval as a quite firm liberty man. Whether he attended any of the rioting seems unlikely. He was quite rueful about it, but he did sign non-importation meetings after that. We know he went to the 1769 4th anniversary celebration of the earlier and less violent of the Stamp Act riots in 1765. So he's part of that foment. But I think as historians and as lay readers of history and watchers of the History Channel, we exaggerate the extent to which, in August 1765, all the world is riveted on Boston, and all of Boston knows that 8 years later, we will be at the banks of the Rubicon with the Tea Party. Copley's experience suggests something different. I mean, his Boston world of trade is really broadening after 1765. I think, the Stamp Act does not leave behind it a landscape of such hardened partisanship or proto-partisanship that he loses his ability to maneuver among different groups with different shades of allegiance. So for him, that happens really much, much later in the imperial crisis. And one of the things that I'm interested in the broader landscape of history suggested by Copley's story, is how many periods in Boston between 1765 and 1773 are really quiet. If you're not reading Sons of Liberty letters and you're not reading the relentless drumbeat of scandal in the Boston Gazette, which is very much trying to keep the flames of 1765 alive, things return to normal for much of the time following that interval. And Copley's life remains pretty darn normal until the early 1770s. I note in the book the confluence that even in 1768, which I think when we're telling the story of the coming of revolution to an America that consists genesis of the 13 colonies, the future 13 colonies. 1768 also looms large, right? We see the occupation of Boston. And even in occupied Boston in 1768, he's painting his iconic picture of Paul Revere, certainly the sort of mind's eye picture of the dawn of revolution that I think outpaces any other, and his portrait of General Gage within months, if not within weeks of each other. So I guess what I would say to Nick's question is, it's amazing how much remains the same in the wake of the Stamp Act. And I hope that Copley's story encourages us to dig into the broader number of stories of just how representative that experience is. They're not all sitting around waiting for revolution to come a decade later.
It sounds like Copley was, if not a patriot as we would classify one today, he was a Liberty man in 1765. What did Copley make of the other two big revolution events in Boston, the Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773?
One thing first is that to be a Liberty man in 1765 or a Liberty woman in 1765 is to seek a better Britain. And that is the way in which Copley was a Liberty man and remained a Liberty man, arguably until his death in London in 1815. The 1770 massacre, we know where he was the day after. He was one of the first to testify when the town fathers of Boston opened the books in Faneuil Hall and said, "Everybody come tell me everything you know." And he mentioned that he had seen soldiers running through Cambridge Street. It's not clear from that one line of testimony whether it's before or after the affray that happened. His baby brother, 10 years younger, so in 1770, he's still a strapling of 20 or 21. He was a hot Liberty man in 1770, and he engraved a representation of the massacre called The Fruits of Arbitrary Power. This is Henry Pelham. Paul Revere stole it, and Paul Revere's iconic engraving of the massacre takes Pelham's drawing and pirates it very successfully as an engraving. So we know that at that moment, the Copley family was appalled by the excesses of the way that the killing on King Street unfolded that night. And then, as it did for most people, in 1771 and 1772, it gets quite quiet again. He's not living a hotly political life. He and his young wife go to New York in 1771 and, to a certain extent, replicate his 7 Years' War experience, painting the many soldiers and imperial placemen who are gathered at the central node of Fort George on Lower Broadway, sort of whirlwind painting tour where he paints 30-some-odd canvases in a period of 3 months. Returns to Boston, and things stay quiet through 1771 and 1772, and he begins to toy again with the idea that he will go to London for a season. It seems entirely possible at that time that one would travel for trade and come back, as many merchants did, and as Copley in his elevated trade as a painter is contemplating doing. The thing that winds up really mucking with that plan are his wife's kin. In 1769, late in 1769, so some months before the massacre, he married Susanna Farnham Clark, who is the daughter of an Indies merchant, a man named Richard Clark, who sold whatever sold well. He sold Carolina goods. He sells a lot of indigo and rice. Who sold West Indies goods. He sells sugar and rum, and who sells some East India goods. He dabbles in tea. He gives up selling tea, Richard Clark does, in the late 1760s as non-importation really heats up. And then when the non-importation agreements collapse, he starts selling tea again. In 1773, after the Tea Act, Clark thinks like this sounds like a moment to make a killing in tea, to get one of these great new East India Company licenses to consign tea in the colonies. And Copley's father-in-law and his brother-in-law are one of the three lucky firms who prevails in July of 1773 in getting an East India Company license. And if you're listening anywhere within spitting distance of Boston or know the unfolding story of the Revolution, well, you know what comes next, right? May you live in interesting times. It turns out not to be such a fortuitous thing to have gotten an imperial license to sell tea in Boston in 1773. So as ships ships begin to approach the colonies that carry consigned East India Company tea that fall, Copley's family politics really put him on a line that has itself become much sharper between patriotism and loyalism.
It's curious, as you note, that Copley had been planning his trip to London, and then the Boston Tea Party takes place. He has relatives who are tea consignees who were basically persona non grata in Boston in December 1773. And then all of a sudden, Copley decides, I'm going to London. Would you tell us how Copley ended up in London after the Tea Party and what he did during his time there?
I think in writing this biography, one of the hardest things I had to wrestle with was what it meant for him to leave then. He leaves in early June of 1774, immediately after the port is closed. By then, the sort of implications of Nick's question about what's it like to try to make your way as an artist in the wake of the Stamp Act, by then the implications of that question have become clear. Nobody has time to be painted. Copley's family, as you said, are not only figuratively but literally persona non grata. His father-in-law and two brothers-in-law are confined to Castle William in the harbor, are threatened with their very lives when they are seen on the streets of Boston or Milton whenever they leave the confinement of the garrison. And Copley also has two young children and a baby. So it would seem like a time where you could imagine saying, oh gosh, I should have gotten out earlier because now I really have to stay here and protect my beleaguered family. And I think the way this plays for him is he decides instead that if he is ever going to go, it had better be then. And it's not clear when he leaves in June of 1774 whether he imagines that he will come back or not, because one of the things I confronted in this book again and again is being forced to remember that he only lives life forward, right? We know what happens next, but he doesn't. So he leaves in 1774. He sails to London, where he has kin and a substantial group of British American exiles who are already there. Hutchinson is also collateral kin by marriage, so gets swept up into this world of Clarks and Hutchinsons and spends a brief time in London, a period of a couple months in London, before seeking his real and ultimate object, which is to make a grand tour of the European continent. And I have a kind of dual camera in Revolution in Color on the remainder of 1774 and 1775, while he's going overland from the English coast through France and into Italy as far as Naples and Paestum, the Greco-Roman ruins at Paestum, and sort of experiencing the wonders of a world that has burst into color as he had dreamt of for at least 10 years and probably longer. And his wife and children and his brother and his mother and his father-in-law and his two brothers-in-law and all of their friends are in a Boston that is at first under grave privation. By the fall of 1774, has begun to anticipate an attack. There's a scare that the attack on Boston is coming in the fall of 1774. It doesn't come. And of course, by the spring of 1775, has broken into open warfare. So he is gaily swanning through the Grand Tour while his family winds up in the middle of the siege of Boston. It was a really interesting dual perspective on a highly contingent moment. He feels terrible for having left, but it's a kind of wonderful terrible where for a man who wanted not to make a choice about political identity, and I think in some ways that's what loyalists are, right? Alan Taylor told us this some time ago. They're the people who remain what they were rather than people who fashion a new national destiny. So for someone who wanted not to make that choice, he's blessed with having no choice left. He writes at one point to his brother after he finds out what has happened in Concord and Lexington. He's terribly worried about his family, but also says, could I have picked a better time to leave? You know, had I left any later, I couldn't have gotten out, and now there is no choice left. I think he's quite relieved at the fact that destiny has chosen them to continue to make their lives in England, which is not an expatriation, but a patriation, right? He's born in British Boston. They're going to continue to make their lives in England by having the family sail to meet him in London, which they do right at the end of 1775.
You mentioned that you grappled with what it was like for Copley to leave Boston in 1774 and what he was thinking. What about in 1783-84 when the United States achieved its independence? Copley had spent the entire war in Europe and London. What did he make of American independence? And did he ever desire to return to Boston?
That's a really complicated question. I think the short answer is he agonized about it for 30 years, right? 1783 to the 18 teens is 30 years. And he never did go back. So I'll start with the firmest thing we know. He didn't go back. He was quite anxious for the fate of his property. So I've said that he was diligent. By 1765, he had amassed a competence that he estimated as an income of about £300 a year. After his marriage, he amassed an estate on Beacon Hill that comprised at its zenith in 1771-72 about 20 acres. Most of what we now know as the neighborhood that's Beacon Hill was originally owned by Copley. He left that competence and that estate behind when he uprooted his family to London. And, if I had to guess what was Copley's first thought on the achievement of American independence, it was, is there a way for me to get my property back? I should say that unlike most of his countrymen, independence did not take Copley by surprise. He says in 1775, America will win. He has seen the vehemence of his neighbors in Boston. From his perspective, he has seen them frothing at the mouth. He knows that they will not back down until every drop of blood is shed. And he says, America will win. And asks his brother in this letter, but what then? Will it be the greatest experiment anyone has ever seen or the greatest despotism man has never known? Cannot tell. Please don't pick up a gun is his urging to his brother in 1775. Don't pick up a gun no matter who asks you. So in 1773, does he think this is the most thrilling experiment the world has ever known? Too soon to tell. A decade later, in the mid-1790s, he's curious enough about this question of the fate of his property that he sends his son to do a kind of reverse grand tour of America and, sort of suss out what's become of the place and whether it might make sense for a now upper middle-aged couple with, near adult children to return to the land of their birth. I think his responses to the United States later in his life are chiefly conditioned by the ongoing state of war in Britain. So it's not coincidence that he takes up this question in writing in 1794, right? The Napoleonic Wars are making London seem intermittently precarious, and one begins to think of America. He follows, and his other compatriots at the Royal Academy in London follow the fortunes of the arts in America, and by 1794, the post-war depression in the colonies, in the former colonies, is giving way to the incredible dynamism of the economy of the early American Republic. And he looks a bit wistfully to see whether he would make it there. I think the same impulse to research and take pains and delay means that the American experiment is never quite compelling enough to him in economic and professional terms to put him back on a boat.
I'd like to ask one more question before we move into the time warp. Jen would like to know what Copley would think about his place in history as one of America's founding and greatest artists. Because, as you just mentioned, it seems like his relationship with the United States was a bit conflicted.
He would unquestionably be proud and thought of himself as something of a founder. When he talked about, the rise of American arts, which he did in the 1760s, I think he meant it with the same kind of regional pride that someone in Derbyshire might have talked about the rise of the arts of the English Midlands, or somebody in Edinburgh might have talked about the rise of Scottish arts. So not as a nationalist project, but he did want to be seen as a founder of that American school. So on the one hand, pride. On the other hand, he certainly did not consider his best work to have been done in the former colonies. He wanted to go to the center of the British Empire so that he could paint more than portraits, so that he could paint the things that needed public and state sponsorship and needed acres of canvas and oceans of time and needed a palace or an exhibition hall or a tent to be seen properly. He wanted to paint big. And so to think that his former countrymen think of Paul Revere as among the greatest of his work, I think he would be bemused, if not appalled. because if he was going to be represented here as a founder, I think he would want us to be looking at the death of Major Pearson or the death of Chatham in the House of Lords or the Siege of Gibraltar, these huge Cecil B. DeMille-like history paintings that encapsulated the whole of his life and the whole of his ambition, rather than the cramped confines of colonial portraiture at which he had excelled just enough to provide a springboard to greater things.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Copley had stayed in Boston after 1774? How would he have weathered the war for American independence, and would he have still been able to make a living as an artist?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm trying to think, Liz, whether I wish he had done that or not. I think he could have weathered the coming of independence quite well, right? We know that Boston, not in 1774, but by, 1786 or 1787, had healed up its wartime rents enough that many of the former loyalists could come back and resume easily a station socially, culturally, economically. So whether he could have weathered it, I don't doubt. He would have sat it out. He would have forged a kind of neutrality. Whether he would have stayed in Boston or gone someplace like Halifax and made his way back, let's put him in Halifax here in the Time Warp and come back. And the thing that I think would have been wonderful for him, had he done such a thing, is there was nobody even remotely of his artistic ability in the early United States until Stuart got back in 1793 and arguably even after, and don't even talk to me about Peel. So he would have had a much more economically viable late career had he been in the United States. There's just no question. Another way to ask this question is, what if Copley had painted Washington? He's the only British American artist of his cohort that does not ever paint George Washington. What if it was Copley's Washington we were looking at instead of Stuart's? I think it would have been a much more deeply insightful portrait. We could have a much less wooden face of the early republic if Copley had been here painting. On the other hand, I don't see how he would ever successfully have painted the upper reaches of the ladder of artistic genres had he not left the United States, right? How would he have learned to paint history, to arrange multiple figures in space? I think not only could he not realize fully his artistic ambitions in the colonies, he couldn't really even see what his ambitions were. So if you look at Copley's mature history paintings, Death of Pearson, Death of Chatham, and you put them against what John Trumbull did with the signing of the Declaration and Battle of Bunker Hill, you see some of what Copley would have given up by staying. And Trumbull, of course, had some season of training in England. He just didn't stay there. So I think he could have saved his pocketbook at the cost of his art.
Charles Willson Peale aside, what project are you working on now that you've revealed the color of Copley's Revolution?
I am toying with a couple of different things, and I'm not fully committed to a new project yet. I think I am likely to leave the colonial period for an interval and do something much more contemporary and much more tied for my next project to the collections of the Schlesinger Library. There are a couple of small projects that I want to do by way of tie-up that come out of the Copley book. I have some King George's War era things that I may like to get back to, but I think next I may land in the 1970s.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can contact you with our questions about John Singleton Copley?
You can find me at my webpage at the Harvard History Department, and my email contact information is there, and I hope people do have questions.
Jane Kamensky, thank you for taking us through Copley's Revolution in color and for revealing the worlds of colonial and revolutionary Boston to us. We really enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks, Liz. It was a delight to talk to you.
Thanks to John Singleton Copley and his largely self-taught ability to paint portraits, we've inherited a rich pictorial history of middle and upper-class early American life. We know how men, women, and children dressed, what they ate, and about the work, hobbies, and objects they found most important. And we know all this because Copley painted this knowledge into his portraits. Copley's life also reveals details about the American Revolution and how many Americans experienced it. Like Copley, most Americans didn't necessarily participate in the revolution or its events. Instead, they watched and wondered about what its outcome would be. This doesn't mean that they were apathetic to the cause. As Jane demonstrated, Copley wanted a better Great Britain and stood as a liberty man in 1765. But he was also a man who exhibited loyalty to both Great Britain, the empire he grew up in, and to Boston, his birthplace and home until 1774. Therefore, the choice the revolutionaries asked him to make between Great Britain and America was a difficult and complicated one. As Jane reminded us, in the 21st century, we know how the American Revolution turned out. But as the event happened, men and women like Copley had no idea what would happen. You can find information about Jane, her book, A Revolution in Color, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/106. I know Jane's discussion of the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party has probably piqued your interest in these events, and I have some really exciting news on that front. There's a historian who's been researching the tea crisis, and she recently found new and exciting information that will change how we view the crisis and the Boston Tea Party. Would you like to know what that information is? You'll have to tune in on December 13 when Ben Franklin's World will mark the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party with a special episode all about the tea crisis of 1773. Finally, what is your favorite Copley portrait or painting? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.